Good morning. This morning we're going to have a look at the last part of the experiments that the British did in governing for the colonial part of Canada, and we're going to look at the Constitution Act of 1791. Before we can start that, I have to remind you that the Quebec Act, which was the last one that we looked at, was brought in because the British feared that the American colonies were going to rebel. And in fact, in 1775, they did rebel. And so there was it's called the American Revolution. And during this time, about 100,000 of American citizens, like people who had been living in the British colonies in America, were essentially kicked out of their homes. They were treated very, very badly, and they were left with no money. And so the closest British colony that they could go to was Canada. So I'm going to read the textbook pages that you're going to need. This might help you in order to understand some of the words, because this one has a few new vocabulary words in it. So let's get started. The United Empire Loyalists. Although Quebec and the Maritimes remained British, the American Revolution was successful. In 1778, France joined the war on the American side. So when the war started in 1775, it was just America versus Britain, but 3 years later, France joined. When the war ended in 1783, a new nation existed, the United States of America. When the war began, people in the 13 colonies began to choose sides. It was difficult to remain neutral. The people who supported independence called themselves patriots, so they would be thought of as rebels by the British. Okay, so they're the ones who wanted an independent country. People who wished to remain part of the British Empire were called Tories by their enemies and Loyalists by their friends. So if you were British and you found an American who wanted to stay British, you called them a loyalist. But if you were American and you found an American who wanted to stay loyal to Britain, you called them a Tory. Family members sometimes ended up on opposite sides in the conflict. Many loyalists were mistreated, fired from their jobs, and forced to leave their homes. Life became unbearable after the war, and many loyalists decided to move to British territory. Now, before we carry on, I want to have a look at this picture here. It says, why were the loyalists poorly treated by the patriots during and after the American Revolution? And what you see here is a group of patriots who have tied up a loyalist and have suspended him in the air. And it was a way of torturing him. There were many other tortures. This was not funny. There was an awful lot of torture that was visited not only on the people who wanted to remain loyal, but also on their families. Okay, back up here then. About 80,000 people left the American colonies during and after the American Revolution. Some returned to England, and a few went to the British West Indies. About 40,000 fled north to Quebec and Nova Scotia. The Loyalists came from all parts of society. Most were farmers, but some were merchants, doctors, and lawyers. Others were recent British immigrants whose loyalty to the mother country was still very strong. Still others did not believe in violence. Germans, Dutch, black slaves, Jews, Mohawks, Quakers, and Mennonites moved because they were afraid of losing their customs and traditions if they stayed in the American colonies. Late Loyalists came for the free land offered to the Loyalists to help them resettle. So that's two different groups here. You've got the groups that wanted to stay loyal to the British. You've got another group who didn't believe in violence, another group who didn't want to lose their customs, and then there's this other group, these late Loyalists. These people were not leaving America because they didn't believe in America. Instead, they were trying to get hold of free land. And so they came to Canada not because they liked Britain, but because they wanted the free land. So we've got a bunch of different motives here. Loyalists changed the Maritimes. More Loyalists came to Nova Scotia than to Quebec. It was a shorter trip by boat, and there were few French Canadians or foreign laws. Britain promised them free land and a supply of food for 3 years. The 30,000 Loyalists who came to the Maritimes encountered harsh conditions. At St. John, for example, nothing had been done to prepare for their arrival. There were no shelters, the land hadn't been surveyed, and there was very little food. The largest Loyalist settlement was in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. More than 10,000 Loyalists settled there. Almost overnight, it became the largest town in Canada. The soil, however, was too sandy for agriculture. The harbor froze in winter, and the surrounding land was rugged and rocky. The Loyalists slowly drifted away, and by 1815, only 600 remained. Hang on, I've got to switch to the next page. The Black Loyalists of Nova Scotia. During the American Revolution, Britain offered freedom to black slaves who left their American masters and fought for Britain. About 3,000 slaves joined the British forces. Although these former slaves expected to be treated like the other Loyalists, they were given the worst land and were treated as second-class citizens. About 1,500 black Loyalists settled in Shelburne, where unemployed laborers became convinced that the black workers took their jobs. In 1784, the workers drove the blacks out of town and destroyed 20 of their homes. It was the first race riot in Canadian history. About 1/2 of the blacks in Nova Scotia came as servants of their Loyalist masters and remained slaves in Nova Scotia. Slavery was abolished in Canada in 1834. The Black Loyalists wanted a better life for their children. Many traveled to Africa to settle in Sierra Leone, a country that had invited them to immigrate. Because the blacks provided cheap labor, many Nova Scotian merchants did not want them to leave. The merchants spread rumors about the harsh climate in Africa and threatened to physically harm them if they tried to leave. However, in 1792, about 1,200 black Loyalists boarded 15 ships and set sail for Africa. The descendants of these Loyalists still live in Sierra Leone. New Brunswick, a new Loyalist colony. About 14,000 Loyalists settled along the St. John River. This was a long way from Halifax, the province's capital. Many Loyalists resented the English merchants in Halifax. Some Loyalists had lost all their belongings, while the people in Halifax profited during the war. Even worse, the government in Halifax did not seem to care about the Loyalists in this area of the province. The Loyalists demanded that they become a separate colony. In 1784, Great Britain divided Nova Scotia into 2 colonies. Because Fredericton was relatively safe from attack, it became the capital of New Brunswick. Like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick had an elected government. Cape Breton was also given its own government until it was joined with Nova Scotia in 1820. The arrival of about 10,000 Loyalists in Quebec changed the political situation. Disputes continued between the British merchants and the French Canadians, but now there were also Loyalists who expected to have rights in government. The British government asked Guy Carleton to resolve the situation as he had done in 1774. Carleton had believed that the French would dominate Quebec forever. Okay, hang on, I've got to get to the next page. Hold on. The large number of Loyalists added a new consideration to his decision. Carleton was still friends with the French Canadians, but he also had fought side by side with the Loyalists and helped them leave New York. Unable to decide between his old and his new friends, Carleton failed to find a solution to the colony's problems. The Constitution Act. Finally, William Grenville, the British minister in charge of the colonies, resolved the issue. He decided to support the Loyalists. By dividing Quebec into two colonies, he hoped to prevent French-English disagreements. By giving French Canadians an elected government under the British system, Grenville hoped to slowly assimilate them. Only the British merchants in Quebec were unhappy. They received an elected government, but since Roman Catholics could vote, the French Canadians could control the government. Under the terms of the Constitution Act of 1791, Quebec was divided into two colonies called Upper and Lower Canada, which later became Ontario and Quebec. Each colony was granted a separate elected government. Roman Catholics could vote and hold office, but only people who owned property were allowed to vote. Upper Canada, that's the British part, received British criminal, civil, and property law. Land was reserved for Protestant churches and schools. Lower Canada received French civil laws. The tithe to the Catholic Church remained. British criminal laws were kept. Farmers could either own land under the British or the seigneurial system. Okay, I'm not going to read this last part in here. I'm going to let you read about the Mohawk Loyalists yourselves. Hopefully that helped you with some of the pronunciation of words.